in Kilkenny. No couple would change the landscape of Ireland more than Isabel and Marshall.
Well, they established a power base in Kilkenny. They started building the castle there. You know, they're both credited with that. I mean, a lot of the time, an heiress would marry and then would be very concerned with homely duties, with the children especially, so they kind of drop out. But Isabel seems different.
Marshall had spent 2 years on the Crusades in the Holy Land, and the castle-building technologies that he used in Ireland were probably learned there. Kilkenny Castle would be their most lasting monument.
In the history of William Marshall, which is the great poem about them, William Marshall explicitly says at one point, "I claim everything through her," to his knights. So she's a living link to him, to the great strongbow, to this tradition of kind of strong men who governed well.
With its curtain wall and 4 towers, the castle resembled the royal castles of Dublin and Limerick. And the couple weren't just responsible for the impressive castle. They rebuilt the city, its walls protecting the merchants of the new Norman town, as well as paying for abbeys and churches around the southeast.
They seem to be operating to the same game plan as a couple. And Isabella, no doubt, would have had a strong notion of herself. I mean, after all, she's the granddaughter of the King of Leinster, with a lineage going back 1,000 years, you know.
There's a very famous incident with Isabel. She was besieged in a castle in Kilkenny when her husband had to go back to England, and she very successfully held off the besiegers while very heavily pregnant. She lowered a man down the battlements to go and get help at great personal risk to herself and the men inside, and he brought back her allies and they lifted the siege. And afterwards, it's described, she took hostages from all the men involved and was quite severe in her punishments of them. And when her husband came back, he overturned many of her punishments, and she's noted in the poem as being quite displeased about it, that she felt they needed to be punished.
But you gotta hand it to them. It's a pretty impressive castle that wasn't just used to house soldiers. You can actually imagine living in it.
So he came over here and it wasn't a bed of roses.
Marshall wasn't part of the original invasion, and the other knights apparently weren't delighted to see him.
They had a rough time when they came over here because they weren't welcomed by the older Anglo-Normans who had been here for some time. But they were tough nuts. She was a tough, feisty lady, and he was a tough knight.
So, from what we can see as we stand here today,
yes,
what can we see that Marshall built?
He built this great circular tower, the keep, which is basically the keep, the West Tower, the North Tower, and there was another tower here. And those towers were linked by what we call a curtain wall. The wall on this side of the castle was taken down in the 18th century.
Okay.
And the people who lived in the castle at that time, the butlers, they wanted a clear view out to the park.
Well, in fairness, yeah, look at the view. I mean, yeah. Okay.
Now, you have to remember there was an outer courtyard to the castle that's underneath the park.
Right.
All that was just swept away to lay out this lovely park.
So they could get a better view.
Exactly. And it just gives you an impression of the kind of wealth that he had access to.
What was his relationship like with the people in the town?
Well, he brought over people when he laid out his new town, known as High Town or the English town. He brought over people from England, and he brought over Flemish people, Dutch-speaking people. And they had their own town over on the other side of the castle, okay?
Right.
So you're dealing with a lot of a fairly multicultural grouping.
But for all the fine architecture, William Marshall built his castle first and foremost as a defensive structure.
See the big thick walls. This is where the lads defended the castle.
This circular room is surrounded by all these little niches, and these gave access to the plunging arrow loops that defended the castle. Yes.
So the boys would be sitting. The sentries have a spot each.
Sentries sat into these.
Okay. So I can see from here now. I've got a great view of
out to the moat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now this is called a plunging arrow loop. It was state-of-the-art type of defensive ope.
So the archer can stand up.
Exactly.
And he can get someone coming up to the gate, or you can also go down there.
Yes.
So you really are snookered if you're caught on that moat.
You're caught out there. You're in a dead zone. Okay.
So they would have sat here for hours.
They would have. guarding, board, as guard duty usually is, until something happens. Then the action starts.
And when something happens, something really happens, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Lived here at the city gates in Kilkenny in March 1650. Now, inside the city, things were pretty bad because a plague had hit. In fact, that plague took the numbers of the garrison down from 1,200 to 400. So naturally, Mr. Cromwell thought that he was going to have it all his own way. But boy, was he wrong.
Kilkenny was the nearest the Confederate Catholics had to a capital city. They controlled about 2/3 of Ireland, headed by the Duke of Ormond, James Butler, whose home base was Kilkenny, of course, and the Ormond Castle in Kilkenny.
Well, the castle was his prime target. And of course, the thing about it is, apart from having great strategic importance in the castle, it also had symbolic importance because Kilkenny was the centre of the Confederacy, where Ireland had more or less partial independence for the previous 8 years, and Kilkenny's parliament was more or less here in Kilkenny. So it had great symbolic significance as well as strategic value.
Cromwell could have been forgiven for thinking that Gaul was an Englishman because the winter that followed was exceptionally short and mild. So even before the end of January, his army was up and marching. And he was able to approach Kilkenny from the southwest early in March 1650 at this stage. And another army is coming from Dublin converging on Kilkenny. So that he's in the field early. His enemies, the Irish, are caught off balance, and moreover, they're plague-ridden. Bubonic plague had come to Galway the previous year, and it had spread throughout the Irish quarters. So the garrison and townspeople of Kilkenny are, by all accounts, riddled with epidemic disease.
But on arriving in Kilkenny on that day, he sent a message to the governor of the castle and to the governor of the city, demanding the immediate surrender of the garrison, and he was presented with a very prompt refusal.
The atmosphere in the city, they must have been
They were absolutely petrified, and they had good reason to be, because this was really literally the enemy at the gates. And when the bombardment started, the cannonballs flew in and not only punched breaches in the wall, but also overshot the wall and hit people's houses and literally decapitated people walking down the streets. He discovered a weak point in the city's defences, a place called Irishtown. 1,000 soldiers entered this weak point. Unfortunately, that was the beginning of the end of the Kilkenny garrison, and the governor of the city offered his surrender, and Cromwell's troops moved in, took over, and ransacked the churches and perpetrated massacres and rounded up prisoners and the whole lot of it.
How many lives were lost, would you say?
Something in the region of 200 or 300 Cromwellian soldiers died, and about 2/3 of that on the defence side. The reason being was, of course, the defenders had the advantage. There's no estimate as to how many citizens were killed, but it could be a few thousand. And many wounded, and then of course people were dying of the plague within the city, even during the siege, so it's very difficult to put an exact figure on casualties. But the Cromwellians paid dearly for the capture of Kilkenny.
Kilkenny was devastated by the bombardment. Most of the important buildings were destroyed and homes were gutted. And Cromwell's troops continued the destruction. The clergy were banished and many of the townspeople were executed. Eventually, a law was passed to clear the city of the citizens. And with Cromwell's admonishment to hell or to Connacht ringing in their ears, many of them went out west and into exile.